Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Malicious Bots, How They Became the #1 New Threat and How to Stop Them, sponsored by Sequence Security. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Arif Hussain, Field Solutions Engineer with Sequence Security. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Arif.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all for joining us. I'd like to begin by just really discussing what is the context in which anyone would care about bots and what is really going on when someone talks about bots. There's so many assumptions and I think so many kind of narrow contexts that tend to be applied before the broader picture is ever really even considered. And so for the purpose of today's conversation, I'd like to just take a moment to step back and say, what is it that is really going on here? So the first thing to consider is when we talk about bots in this particular context, all of you are involved with some type of business. Those bots are really representing people and are trying to do the things that would otherwise be done by people. And so why would that be the case? Well, since the dawn of time, merchants have been exchanging goods and services. And in the current time, we do that via web applications, mobile applications, APIs, and a much more complex set of tools. Nonetheless, the basic ideas are still relevant. So when dealing with any particular enterprise, whether it's in financial services or retail or travel or social media or any other kind of modern online business or business that has significant online presence, there are going to be a wide range of different applications that are in use where customers and partners and suppliers and of course the business itself can all provide or access the services that are required. That being the case, then the values that are involved in these businesses are necessarily going to be targets for attacks through all of the methods that we just discussed. So the APIs now become a target as well as of course the web and mobile applications. And so what are the kinds of attacks that are relevant? Well, the first kind is really the ones that are targeting the business itself. And so these are different than those that target the infrastructure or the tools. And so let me clarify. If you're a business, let's say in airlines, who's trying to allow customers to search for a flight, book a flight, and then purchase a flight, well, you would set up maybe a search engine, you would allow access to all of your inventory, and you would of course have some kind of shopping cart and payment system in place. If someone does a search for a flight, but then repeats that search and essentially extracts all of your flights and does so every 30 seconds and takes all of that data and builds a business where they're reselling your inventory, well, that is an abuse of the business logic itself. Technically speaking, they have not exploited any vulnerabilities in the application. The vulnerability that they're exploiting is the one that essentially the business created by trusting its users to do the thing that they were expecting. And so this introduces the notion of intent. A business has an intent for building an application. They're trying to enable their customers or their partners or what have you to do certain kinds of behaviors. And if someone chooses to misuse those applications and do other kinds of behaviors, those fall into the category of business logic abuse. They tend to be very difficult to detect because many of the tools that have existed often focus on vulnerability exploits. And so these are things that are, I think, much more familiar to us. There are resources like OWASP and PCI and so many others that regard the kinds of vulnerabilities that exist in low-level code in applications and databases and of course web servers and so forth. And those things can be used to gain access to information or value that also is not intended to be shared, but it's a significantly different kind of attack. It's looking at the places in the tool or in the machine, so to speak, that are that have vulnerabilities, rather than in the business itself. And so what would you do if you were going to manage all of the traffic coming in? In this case, traffic basically just representing business transactions. Well, you would identify what are all the places that someone might want to attack. So for business logic, I gave you an example of an airlines with a search inventory. Another very common example is a company that has secure accounts. Essentially, every company that does any kind of retail online has ATO, due to there being value stored in secure accounts. So that would be a second kind of attack target. Then you would basically analyze the incoming traffic and determine whether it's human or from a bot. There is a common assumption that bots tend to be bad, although of course there are good bots. And so humans also have bad humans. And so there's ultimately really what you want is the traffic that you want and the traffic that you don't want. You could call good or bad. And all of these things are going to apply to all of your different application tiers. And so for our purposes, we would consider web, mobile, and API as one unified point of access, although of course there will be significant technical differences in each one of them. Ultimately, if your business is storing value, then those different channels will allow different kinds of access to that value and will be the motivation for criminals to seek access. One way to think about it is that a business is trying to provide a even exchange, and a criminal is trying to establish an imbalance exchange, and so also known as stealing, and that will largely be the focus of the kinds of motivations that we're describing today. So what are the benefits of filtering out the traffic that you want from all the other? Well, for one, all of the value that you're meaning to retain and exchange in a balanced way will be secure, meaning you will not lose any of that value. And then the infrastructure that was built to provide access to that value will necessarily be faster and less taxed. We've seen so many businesses who come to us just for no reason other than demands on infrastructure. There was one airlines that saw 14x increases in their traffic, and it wasn't apparent that these were a result of scraping attacks from bots, but it appeared to be a DDoS effect, and ultimately the resolution was in identifying the type of traffic and what the intent of that traffic was. And then, of course, looking at things from the incident point of view, having a customer complain that their account was breached, or having a customer say that they were unable to access a site, these are incidents that will necessarily be reduced when traffic is being filtered based on the actual business value that traffic offers. So let's look at business logic abuse specifically. So we talked about there being good bots, bad bots, good humans, and bad humans. Well, what are these things doing? Well, first off, typically speaking, the reason we come across bots is that the kinds of systems that are in place to enable humans to access business, or the business logic that we've described, well, they're there to support very large volumes or populations of users. And so generally speaking, there is an assumption that there will be thousands, if not millions, or even billions of transactions representing a very standard, mundane business experience online. And this is from the business perspective. And so as a result, a bot provides a very easy way and cheap way for an attacker to, for example, take content over and over again. They can create fake accounts, they can check gift cards, they can enter social media spaces where the value is largely around community and the content that is trusted to be shared and to be sort of described with different values and reputations within that community. And they can manipulate those relationships by improving reputations of certain users of certain pieces of content. So all of these are things that benefit from the easy access to scale. And so because scale is a necessary part of how businesses use online access, then bots represent a cheap way to provide that scale. They're cheap, they're fast, they're effective. Why is that? Well, First off, let's focus on three different kinds of attacks: account takeover, fake account creation, and scraping. These represent a very large portion of the most financially impactful attacks. Well, ATO, if you're using credentials, is very easily done. Credentials are widely available. Most of us know this. There are the tune of billions of them available. Most people reuse their passwords. Therefore, those credentials are pretty good on more or less any site of your interest. There are tools that enable you to easily apply those credentials to any site of your interest. And then the infrastructure that's required to take advantage of these tools is also quite readily available. And so really the chips are stacked in favor of attackers. There's such an enormous incentive to do this kind of attack. I think that there's an assumption that it will never go away, at least not until the dynamics of that or the economics of that exchange can be changed. So let's look at one of the tools. Sniper is a tool that we see very commonly. It's a popular tool. One of the things that I found pretty enlightening or surprising, I guess, when I entered the application security space 5 or 6 years ago, is just how well developed these pieces of the ecosystem are. We're not talking about sophisticated cybersecurity coders who are doing these attacks at large. In this case, you can see this is a website with a nice user interface. Often these companies provide customer support. It's kind of absurd in a certain way how well developed and consumer friendly this kind of behavior has become. That being said, here's what the Sniper tool looks like. Choose your attack target, decide what you are in the mood for, I suppose, this day, and then move on your merry way. Of course, there are also those who more specialize in the kind of a fraud that they're interested in. There are, of course, value chains where people are hired to do certain things, improve product reviews, for example. And there are, a variety of folks who live in unfortunate circumstances that enable them to behave with more or less similar economics to, mechanical bots. And so, again, the idea here is the access to cheap scale. And so whether it's people or machinery, these are things that leverage high volume attacks where a small amount of value is extracted over and over again. And this is largely what we're talking about when we say, malicious bots are becoming the new #1 threat. The notion here is that the ability to extract a small amount of value and repeat is so easy to access that it is going on at massively large scales. So let's talk about the other set of potential vulnerabilities. That's in the infrastructure itself. Many of you are very familiar with some of these different tools. Each of them, necessarily have certain vulnerabilities related to how they function. It will never be completely resolved, and so an attacker will exploit some weakness or bug in one of the data tools or in one of the web tools, and the only real strategy is for security to sort of keep pace with DevOps. Applications are deployed and built in a typical standard plan, often code, build, test, release, deploy, operate, etc. And security teams, excuse me, are if they're in the loop, can still have challenges, and very often we find that they're just simply not really a part of that DevOps cycle in a way that ensures that they have the ability to really identify all of the vulnerabilities that they would need to identify in order to have a support strategy that would prevent any attacks. So let's look at Apache. It's deployed at the majority of the top 1 million Alexa sites. There are all kinds of opportunities there. Typically, you would run a scan, see what vulnerabilities, or an attacker would run a scan to see what vulnerabilities are available, and then they would then exploit that vulnerability. Just a simple example of how this kind of thing is done. So we have a couple of different research firms that have produced some, collected some data on these topics. So I just thought I would mention them. The Osterman report is focused on bot attacks, and the Ponemon Institute report is focused on app exploits. And these are very large research documents that can be found online. There's copies of them on our website. But just to kind of highlight some of the findings, there was about 800 orgs in the US that were studied, and more than 300 different apps in various hybrid environments. And typical security defenses were in place in these research models, so WAF, CDN, and what we're calling first generation bot management tools. So what were found? Well, maybe no surprise to many of you, all of the organizations experience attacks. Why wouldn't they? They have value. It's very easy for attackers to gain access to that value. Of course, they're being attacked. They typically had one full-time person just looking after bot defense, costing them close to $200,000 a year. Often took a couple of days to actually detect the attack, and then a couple of days to mitigate. Ponemon found that all of them relied on WAF, that most of these orgs had attacks that lasted a year, that most of them were using their WAFs just for alert in logging mode only, and they were spending upwards of $400,000 a year on the WAF itself, and another $200,000 on the administration, and possibly dealing with more than a full-time employee's week of just the alerts, and about half a week of dealing with rules. No surprise, less than half of them were satisfied, and that tracks to less than half of them really feeling an effectiveness of their applications. So this may be obvious based on what we just discussed here, but the impact on productivity is significant. So less than half, this ESG group reports that less than half of their studied folks, 267 IT professionals, were unable to really learn about how to use their security tools to the full potential. They were having to train junior personnel. They couldn't really find experienced folks. They had limited time to deal with these things, and there was just a shortage of acute skills across the board. And so, what does this mean to us? Well, we know that the attacks are motivated, they're not going away, and they come in more or less two forms that are exploiting the business and exploiting the tools. And so how do you provide a defense that includes all of this, that you look at the two different vectors, the two different strategies, and the two different requirements? Well, here are a few things that might be useful to consider. So there are already, of course, values in the tools that exist. And so one question is, was the tool built specifically for this purpose? So, for example, many CDNs are struggling to continue to grow their businesses, and so, of course, are rolling in new products and services, which may or not be as useful as something that is designed specifically for that purpose. Web, mobile, and APIs tend to be discussed separately, not because of the values that are different, largely just because they are difficult to handle in terms of technologies that deal with web, for example, tend to focus on JavaScript, since that's what browsers can execute, whereas, say, mobile would focus on SDKs if they were requiring any kind of client code. APIs often mean that there is no control over the endpoint, and therefore that is necessarily a different group. But again, just thinking of this as business, where there's value and folks trying to access that value, well, then the question is, how could you protect all of your value by protecting all of the channels? Another very important thing that we often see is that in order to protect value, there often needs to be an explicit naming of how that value is accessed. So if there is a DevOps cycle where new flows are added, or even in the beginning when a new tool is added, how do you ensure that you aren't missing anything? Well, discovery can be a helpful thing. Is your tool actually going to find the targets, or will you have to find them and potentially risk missing one in the beginning or ongoing as a maintenance strategy? We talked about bot attacks, of course, so the question is, will your tool prevent those kinds of attacks? We talked about vulnerability exploits. Will your tool prevent those kinds of exploits? Is your tool going to require a lot of grooming and maintenance? Will you have to see the attacks before you stop them, or can there be zero-day security available? Are these things integrated? I mean, I think most of us in security really think about context as the key here. The information gained in one siloed point of view shared with another siloed point of view can open up significant awarenesses of threats. And so the best tools will have complete context. The criminals or attackers are very often deceiving these tools by hiding sort of in between the gaps in certain tools scope. And so integrating these tools can be a significant advantage, assuming that they're actually sharing the data that they're gathering. And then what is it that security folks, personnel can understand about intent and behavior? Again, we're very often addressing problems on a very low level, technical level. This is a request that seems that has irregular semantics, or the syntax is unreasonable. But the question is, what is the intent? Someone or some entity generated these kinds of requests. Why are they doing that? And that question actually interfaces with why is the customer, or I'm sorry, the business actually providing access in this way. And that point of view can be significant advantage to considering how to resolve the actual problem, because ultimately an attacker who is not interested in attacking, which is to say that you have changed their motivation or changed the economics in which their intent made some sense, that's going to be the most secure adversary, someone who's not actually trying to attack. And then finally, what does this have? What do all of these attacks? How do they bear on your performance? And can your security tool consider infrastructure requirements, whether it's the actual load on your Nginx cluster, or the cost, utilization costs of your cloud provider, or even something ancillary like airlines who pay for Amadeus or Sabre? Those fees can be significantly reduced when scraping attacks, for example, aren't exploiting those third-party APIs. And so maybe another way to look at it is the findings were showed that there was a lot of disappointment. What are the things that these organizations really want? Well, again, you might guess some of this, but it's nice to see the raw actual numbers. Most of them would like more automation, just to have, in this case, automation of the security models, where they're not having to spend half a week adding new WAF rules. The rules generate themselves, and intelligence that allows them to decide what rules should be are key points here. What do I know? Is that information helpful and actionable, and can that information be applied on its own without human intervention? And then AI is mentioned a lot. I will clarify what I mean when I say it's relevant to our particular focus, but in short, is a way to classify, at least in the very frequently used machine learning components of AI, to classify categories of different kinds of things. And so in this case, knowing what's good and what's bad, or what's automated and what's not, or what's whatever is reasonable or unreasonable in the various ways that might be considered, can be significantly improved with the use of AI. And so they also basically just want all of this to apply to all of their apps, all of their different channels. As I said, the distinction of these different channels is really somewhat of a legacy point of view. So Sequence Security, where I work, is founded by former Palo Alto Networks and Symantec staff, and they bring to bear both business and technology skills specifically to address some of the things that we've discussed. The way that we approach the problem is through a completely software-based model. One of the challenges of introducing any tool is, particularly when it needs to apply to all production traffic, is how do you do that in a way that isn't a non-starter? so many companies are simply unable or unwilling to have a third-party piece of code or product or proxy engage with all of their production traffic in a way that introduces far more risk than they're willing to entertain. And so our model first starts with the belief that no tool is useful if it can't be used. And so the container-based model is a significant advantage. The next is a integrated approach where, when thinking about things from a broader perspective, as we started out with, the idea is what should be happening here, and then in some sense you now have a set of things that shouldn't be happening that can be examined, and then the way to examine those things is by leveraging very specific modules that are tied to each particular use case. And so ideally, all of that information is then shareable, both in terms of a single interface. CQ Insight is what we call our dashboard, which I will demo for you in a moment, but also recognizing that many organizations already have models, operational models that are oriented around different viewpoints, whether it's Splunk or something else. And so a tool that is gaining insight about what's going on should easily share that insight with all other systems to ensure that there's no loss of context. And that's something that that our tool is also set up to do, which I will show you when I demo. We talked about what are the things that this tool needs to do. Well, the first thing is to actually discover the relevant targets. And so in order to manage that, there needs to be a way to see the traffic that's actually coming in, as opposed to having to guess potentially inaccurately. And so discovery is a key component. The detection is something that involves deciding, well, what are the characteristics of bad behavior? Well, in the case of a bot attack, those characteristics can easily be componentized into the way that someone, a person who is trying to actually carry out a particular attack is going to do that. And so one common, the dimensions that are always relevant are, number one, what is the network or infrastructures they're using? Well, if you're a company who only does business in the United States, then it's already suspicious if you're seeing traffic outside of the United States. If you're a business that only has customers who are 99% residential, and you're seeing requests coming from a cloud host, well, that's odd, right? So these are very simple examples, very crude examples of how network infrastructure would be a source of suspicion. But the same is also true for tools. Most consumer businesses are expecting traffic to be generated from web browsers or mobile devices. They could easily track and focus on the expected the HTTP frameworks that are in play. And so again, if you see traffic coming from any kind of script, whether it's Python or some kind of tool like Sniper or Sentry MBA or Seculi or Phantom.js, all of these are potentially suspicious. So that's kind of a second area, is the tool itself. A third area would be the credentials. If there is an ATO type attack in use, if you know that a large number of the credentials coming in from a particular source are known to be a part of some breach, that also can add consideration for whether this traffic is good or bad. And then finally, the behavior itself we talked about. If you see that someone is signing up for an account for a social media site and their email address is very obviously a garbage email address, well, that pretty clearly suggests that their intent is not to actually participate according to the rules of that particular site. And these are all things that can be detected using with access to enough information and the ability to organize that information. And I will show you that in a moment. The final thing is, of course, having enough specificity to defend against your applications in a way that you are not blocking any real users. It goes without saying that security, in terms of blocking type security, is always going to ask, engender the question, what is your rate of false positives? How can I ensure that my real users are not being blocked? This is something critical that any security vendor would really need to consider, and it's something at the core of our product model here. Ideally, there are no changes and there are no signatures to change and there's nothing to monitor. And so that's something that we can discuss as well. So how does our platform approach the problem that I've laid out? Well, there are currently two modules. The app firewall was just recently launched. For the interest of time today, I'm going to focus on bot defense. I would encourage anyone who has interest to follow up and set up a demo, which we'd be happy to do. But the overall platform supports both sets of attack types that are those that are focused on exploiting business logic using cheap scale, doing things like account takeover, fake account creation, reputation attacks, and scraping. And then the app firewall is looking for various kinds of application exploits where we can provide insight into what those applications are expecting and therefore automatically generate profiles that eliminate the need for chasing down signatures as a main way to deal with the application. I will switch now to the Insight demo and hopefully clarify some of the points I made in brass tacks. This is the interface. What you're looking at is a demo. This one happens to be running on AWS. The traffic that is reaching this demo is generated by our own Python scripts, and it's meant to represent a very typical site organized around e-commerce. This is a live demo, so you see there's all sorts of traffic that comes outside of our own scripting. It's being sent out to proxies, Tor feeds, etc. And so the first thing I'll show you, there's three sections, as I mentioned: discover, detect, and mitigate. The discover section is here to demonstrate exactly what is observed. So the deployment model that's being used here is one where there's a sensor. That sensor can be deployed in a wide range of different options. It can be an Nginx, a dynamically loadable module, which is mirroring traffic. It can be a sidecar model that supports Envoy and other kinds of web services. It can be used in service mesh. It can be used as a reverse proxy. The key is that the sensor is seeing a copy of the traffic. It can also be done physically using a tap or span port. And so that sensor is generating this sitemap. So what you're seeing here is a typical flow. If I go through, for example, the checkout flow, you'll see that there's a cart, there's ability to add to the cart, there are products. Each one of these things has a number. That number in this case is representing the actual number of get or post requests that were observed in this particular time frame. And you'll also note these little green words. These are tags that I created to help me sort through all of my different channels. So again, the idea here is that one, discovery is automating the process of determining what traffic actually exists so that you ensure that no traffic is missed. We very commonly have customers who are using another tool, one of our competitors' tools, for example, and they did not explicitly specify an older version or a deprecated version of an app, and only through the impact of those attacks discovered that attackers were still attacking such an app. Or conversely, they didn't expect there to be a huge amount of attack traffic on their password reset tool, but it turns out that when you put in an email address, there's an XHR that tells you this email address exists in the system, and so they observed 99% attack activity on something that they didn't appear to have much value, but is in fact a nice refinery for criminals who are looking to verify whether their lists are relevant to a particular site. So these are the values. You can find channels that you weren't expecting for all variety of reasons that might be true. And then two, you can be sure that you can glob all of your traffic together, which is to say web, mobile, and API, knowing that you can very easily look at the one or very specific set of things that you're interested in. The tags are also available for review as part of the Discover section. So moving to Detector, the thing that a customer of ours would typically want is, one, how do I start to organize a big glob of traffic, as I said, into actionable groups? And then two, how do I start to describe each one of those groups in ways that allow me to precisely and effectively apply some kind of action while being confident that I'm not accidentally influencing users that I actually care about. Well, let's focus on the first thing. Our tool, what you're seeing here should be fairly familiar to most folks. It's a dashboard. We're seeing number of requests over time. In this case, there is a distinction between what we're calling attack traffic and legitimate traffic. I can explain that in a moment. Let's focus now just on the basis of these groups. There are groupings that are typically available that would be familiar to you, like organizing by IP or by browser. I will focus on fingerprint. In this case, this is a term that we use to represent a source framework. So you could expect Chrome to have a fingerprint that's different than Firefox, which would be different than, say, a native iOS app, different than an Android app, and so forth. In this case, the fingerprint is not trying to identify a specific user, but rather a class of users or group of users oriented around a single framework. For anyone familiar with bot attacks, you might realize that one reason that's very advantageous is that a very simple bot attacker is likely going to have one or a few fingerprints because they probably took a tool like Sniper, and that tool can easily be identified and its fingerprint can be blocked. We have seen attacks where there were hundreds of thousands of requests, each coming from a unique IP and each from a unique fingerprint. And so it is still possible to block attacks that are much more sophisticated, that are going to much greater lengths to try to obfuscate their intent. But nonetheless, it's a useful starting point to organize traffic into basically where it's coming from, where the where is the type of device, or actually the code and the infrastructure. And then as a second useful function, to then take each one of those groups and then decide what you know about it. So let's follow the catalog example that we were looking at before. I'm going to filter this traffic down just to the catalog flow. So what that's done is just showing me the traffic that is flowing through those particular URIs. And now I have a few fingerprints that's representing that traffic. And the first thing I see is that fingerprint number one appears to be triggering a rule that I created called catalog scraping. Now, excuse me. Now I'm going to start with behavior because I think that's really the most interesting thing, and then we can walk back into some of the other dimensions. So how does this work? Well, there are a set of rules. They're really triggers that come out of the box. They fall into the categories that we described before. And then there are custom rules that can be created. And so part of the context that is routinely lost with any tool is the context that is generated by the insight and understanding of the security personnel and the application personnel themselves. Any business is likely to know what their typical user does. So, for example, if you're selling an airline ticket or a pair of shoes, maybe you know that 99% of your users will typically load your catalog page 2 or 3 or let's say 5 times. And so if that's the case, then you could set up a rule where, in this case, this is a simple MVEL language that's derived from Java, which many of you can read to say that this particular variable, which happens to be a counter for the number of times that someone requested content from a particular URI, within 60 seconds from a particular source has exceeded some number. So if the number of good users is 5, maybe I set this to be 10, and that's a very conservative model for what suggests scraping. And so this is a simple example of how I can, in about 10 seconds, first set up a counter where I'm looking at all of the various kinds of things that happen, like how many times did someone succeed in their login, how many times did someone fail in their login, how many times were one of their credentials matched in some known breach, and then something custom where I say, how many times did they make a GET request to /catalog. And so when that's the case, if I then do go and see a fingerprint that's coming from a common source, and I see that in this case, 100% of those requests, in this case, GET requests, are triggering a rule which I believe to be a very conservative model for bad behavior, well, I can decide that this fingerprint is bad and take care of it immediately. So one of the key advantages to this tool is that it balances the machine learning and research that's acquired from our threat intelligence team with the human readable and sort of very visible and obvious results and ability to manage of our customers. So what does that mean? This is not a black box. There's nothing that is going on that is that requires any kind of trust or reliance on a team that's outside of this particular tool. The way that the tool is set up is that all of the users are in the exact same interface. So typically our customers will set up our staff to have access to their deployment. So there's no God's eye view or special admin dashboard where things are done. There's a single deployment, and so that allows security on a variety of levels. But one of the key things that it provides is the ability to have all of the analysis done on site or in situ. And so, what benefit does that have? Well, many security products, particularly in the bot defense space, will extract a certain amount of telemetry, very often client-side telemetry gathered by JavaScript or SDKs. But in any case, it will be some limited amount of telemetry which will be sent to some admin cloud for analysis. Most of us are familiar with all of the various kinds of compliance, such as GDPR, that apply to PII, and so that becomes a very difficult thing to deal with when the context is really stored in rich data. So let me give you an example. We have a customer who is using one of our competitors' bot tools. They were able to effectively mitigate bot attacks, but they had about 500,000 fake accounts being created every year. Those fake accounts, it turns out, were being created manually, and therefore were bypassing their bot defense. So our team was able to use machine learning analysis on the content of the usernames that were being generated in these fake accounts, or really in all of their account signups, and they were able to create a model. A model that describes what they described as keyboard mashing. And so this is an actual rule that we have in place that is able to use a machine learning model to classify whether or not the content of a username suggests that it's a real username, like rf@sequence.ai, or it's someone who just mashed on their keyboard in an effort to bypass the first step in a sign-up process, not realizing that anyone was looking. And so this is literally one of the ways that we have stopped all of those fake accounts from being created. And it speaks to two different things. One, the need, or I should say the great advantage it is to be able to actually examine secure data. And two, the idea of intent being more important than methodology. So if you're only trying to look for the amount of entropy associated with human use of your application, meaning how are their keystrokes, how are their mouse movements, etc., then you're going to be limited when humans are actually doing the activity. One of the real challenges of creating a sustainable model is considering the adversary that you create based on the challenges that you introduce. So everyone who's familiar with the security space realizes that introducing a new challenge to a sufficiently motivated adversary will necessarily cause them to evolve. And so providing a sustained secure service requires you to be prepared to deal with the adversary that you create, and so on and so forth in a kind of infinite loop. So by focusing on intent as opposed to methods, our tool is intending to access that leapfrog model at its most core and foundational point, which is to say that before anyone found a tool and ran it on infrastructure and acquired credentials and decided to ATO some site of their interest, they had some intention, some plan for what they were trying to do and why they were motivated to do that. If you were able to ascertain what that intention is through those characteristics, through the network, the tool, credentials, and behavior, if you're able to see obviously what they're meaning to do, then that is the most secure point of view, at least from our perspective, of how to interface with the problem. And so getting back now to the particular fingerprint. So if I look at a trigger and I see that there's scraping behavior, I can also correlate that with other kinds of suspicion. Because again, the key here is how can I organize my my traffic into groups of absolutely 100% certain we want it and absolutely certain we don't want it. There will always be that group of uncertainty. And so I will address that in a moment, but for purposes of confirming, so let's say in this case, this very clear case that this appears to be behavior that is scraping, we can additionally support that by saying, well, in addition to being behavior that shows scraping, there is also significant suspicion around where that infrastructure, or I'm sorry, where those requests came from. They all came from a Tor feed. The tools that were in use were very suspicious. And so the way that this interface is representing legitimate and unwanted traffic is through a confidence threshold. And so many of you are familiar with this concept from fraud tools. There's a threshold that suggests that anything above it will be considered attack traffic. So where the confidence is inversely proportional to risk. And so if I set this very high, I can exclude as much traffic as I want. And then the fingerprints that are being demonstrated are the fingerprints that are associated with things that I believe might be unwanted. And so where is this number coming from? Well, each one of our triggers has a weight, you might have noticed, associated with it, and those are tallied up, as well as, of course, custom rules where you can assign the weight you decide is relevant, and that provides a way to start to consider these threat vectors in a more distributed way. So again, thinking about things as having certainly unwanted and should be stopped, certainly good and should be allowed. How do you deal with that middle area, which tends to be where most security folks spend most of their time focusing? Well, that comes into the last area that I want to focus on around mitigation. As we mentioned before, there are two different modules that are currently available. That is the bot defense module, which is designed specifically to mitigate against automation. And then there's the app firewall model, which is designed specifically to mitigate against application vulnerabilities. Both of these will derive from all of the information that I just described to you. So what I've really been showing you is the intelligence in the CQ AI platform, which is more or less to categorize what are we expecting to happen and how can I be sure that that is what I allow to happen. And so I'm going to focus just on the bot defense and open things up to questions in just a moment. So to create a policy to mitigate, and we're using the term mitigate to mean both literally stop as well as inform other systems, I can just add a policy, establish criteria, which is either a set of confidences or a confidence score that has to be exceeded. It can have additional filters that require me to say, for example, trigger a particular rule. In this case, the catalog rule that I created might be the rule that I'm interested in having triggered. And so I have a few different policies set up here where one policy just simply blocks against a rule. And then the triggers, or I'm sorry, the responses to those criteria, the actions that are taken, can more or less cover all actions that you would expect to be possible, which is to say that I can, as a bot defense module, we will necessarily need to be deployed in line. I mentioned that the CQ AI platform is deployed out of band, and that's to minimize any risk. There does not have to be a bot defense module. It can, other options can be used. So for example, CQ AI can inform other tools via REST API. So we have customers who are, for example, having one of their fraud tools be updated with which usernames were involved in a particular attack, so that the fraud team who is used to doing manual forensics on their users can immediately get a notification that a very suspicious web transaction or a very suspicious mobile transaction has just occurred, And rather than wait several hours to see that that transaction is then followed by a dozen other transactions which represent fraud, which they are typically used to finding after the fact, our tool will notify them immediately and let them know that essentially a suspicious or sort of pre-fraudulent a transaction has occurred, meaning someone is coming in from odd infrastructure. They're apparently doing odd behavior. They could be using known potentially stolen credentials, and that suggests that there's reason to consider them likely to do something unwanted. And that's really the way that we address the problems that we described in the beginning. With malicious bots being one of the most common threat vectors, it's important to undermine the cheap use of scale and get at what is the intent, and then very quickly decide, do I want to just literally block those requests, which I can do by just returning a forbidden response, or I can rate limit them. I can provide deceptive content. So again, realizing that an unmotivated attacker is the best attacker. Well, one way to ensure that they're not trying to evolve is to make them think they're succeeding. And so we have a very large financial services company for whom we provide alternative deceptive content that's language localized to dozens of different languages and is confusing attackers who believe that they're succeeding and have to basically burn resources and time before they realize that they are not. And then finally, I mentioned our REST API. Of course, we can output to syslog and similarly provide all of the different fields that are interesting and enable our system to tie directly into other systems so that our tool can be 100%, or I should say 0% false positives, meaning guarantee no false positives, because there's no mitigation that it's doing, and you can just tie the data into other systems that might have their own security models and their own restrictions and compliance settings already adopted by the org. I think that at this point we have about 9 minutes left. I'd be happy to open things up to questions if there are any.
All right, thanks for that great presentation, Arif. At this point, I do not see any questions. Maybe we can give people just a moment here to see if they want to submit any. While they're thinking, I want to remind everyone that you can find your CEUs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigate to your account dashboard, then click My Webcasts. You can then download your CEU on the right-hand side of the web page. All right, I'm not seeing anything come in, so I'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you so much, Arif, for your great presentation, and to Sequence Security for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.